This week on Quadriga, global security, cooperation or confrontation. Europeans respect human dignity, freedom and the rule of law. But in many parts of the world, basic rights are still a distant dream. Old dangers remain, like war and the refugees it creates. And new threats, including terrorism and cyber attacks, have emerged as central issues. Globalization has brought opportunities, but also risks and uncertainties. How can states strike the right balance between mutual respect and security? Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. This weekend, numerous heads of state, foreign ministers and global security experts will meet once again in Munich at the Munich Security Conference to tackle and discuss the most pressing and urgent security issues of our time. And certainly there will be no shortage and lack of issues to be discussed. And that's why we have invited three experts today, three security official experts, who will discuss with us the most pressing issues of our time that mankind is facing and how to tackle them. And for that, we are joined by Markus Kaim, who heads the International Security Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He also teaches at the Department for Political Science at the University of Zurich and at the Berlin-based Hertie School of Governance. Alexandra Rahr is one of Europe's most prominent experts on Russian affairs. A research director at the German-Russian Forum, he has written numerous books on Russia and has played a pivotal role in the release of Russian businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And Alison Smale is the Berlin bureau chief of the New York Times. In her accomplished career as a journalist, she also served as the deputy foreign editor at the New York Times and the executive editor of the International Herald Tribune. Welcome to you all. Certainly no shortage and lack of topics to be discussed. That's why let's get right into it. Alexandra Rahr, as I said, many experts will be meeting in Munich this weekend. If it were up to you, what would be the single most pressing issue that the discussant in Munich should be tackling?
I think at such gatherings as the Munich Security Conference, of course, themes like how to handle globalization with all its challenges and chances should be discussed, broadly discussed among experts, among politicians. It's a good opportunity. But if I would choose a single issue, which I think is a pressing danger and a real challenge for the world right now, the biggest from my point of view is still the Islamic terrorism. This is still the threat to the West, to Russia, to other countries. As long as we will not find a kind of dialogue with the Western world, with the Western culture, with Islam, we will see the continuation of these problems which we have in the Middle East, in the Near East, and also in our societies.
And international terrorism, certainly one of the aspects we will talk about on today's show. Markus Kaim, what would your choice be?
My number one choice would be the sectarian division of the Islamic world, the division between Sunni and Shia, which affects not only Syria but the whole Islamic world, and is, at least to a certain degree, contributes to the transformational problems of the Arab world. My number two would be an old one, fragile states like Mali, like the Central African Republic. This is not a new phenomenon, but we're still coping with all these problems. And the third one is maybe not a security challenge, but more of a concern. It's, I would call it the retrenchment of the US from international relations, or some even call it isolationism. The question is who's going to fill the vacuum in international relations like the US has done for the last 60 years. And this is a critical challenge, particularly for the Europeans.
Well, certainly you have given us a lot of food for thought for the upcoming discussion. But Alison Smale, I want to ask you also, if you were to identify the single most important and relevant security challenge facing mankind today, what would you say?
Well, I think sort of apart from the ones that have already been mentioned, which are clearly very important, the issue of cybersecurity is becoming more and more of an issue. And related to that, as we heard Chancellor Merkel say quite strikingly, in German Parliament yesterday. I mean, the question of striking the balance between what's possible now digitally and what you really ought to do in terms of surveillance. I think these are going to be increasingly huge issues if you think that people younger than us can't really imagine a world without computers and the internet, rely on that for everything. And we really have to get down to thinking, how much does that put all of us right out there? Do we care? Does this change human consciousness? I think it does actually change the way human affairs are going to be conducted.
Well, certainly we've now heard a wide variety of issues, and we will try to get to each and every one of them during the show. But I think all these issues and all these challenges that you have mentioned already begs the question, of course, who will be in charge? Who will be the country or the countries able and capable of dealing with them? And let's start with the most obvious, of course, the United States. The United States, many people, including the journalist of the newspaper, German newspaper, Die Zeit, Josef Joffe, he wrote a book titled The Myth of U.S. Decline. And there seems to be a popular notion these days to say the United States is in decline, America's power is not as strong, and its dominance is not as strong as it once used to be. Would you agree with that assessment?
It's difficult to say, because on the one hand, the United States is still the military world power number one. And despite of the financial crisis, in a relatively good shape economically. I even think that the United States could lead the West out of the financial crisis quicker than the European Union. But the United States is less and less a moral leader of the West because of its own problems, because Europe is finding its own identity now again, 70 years after the World War II, when America was invited to bring freedom to Europe. Now we have other challenges. America's transatlantism is, in my view, not so much needed as in the years before. And I must say, we didn't tackle one very important issue, which I think will be key on the Munich Security Conference agenda. This is Ukraine. Ukraine is maybe facing a revolution. It's facing, I hope not, but some analysts say a civil war. And we Europeans, together with the Russians, have to solve the problem of Ukraine. But here I come to the United States. The United States is not involved in this case and can't be involved because it's a matter of Europeans. So we are now in the position as Europeans, the Russians, to solve this kind of problems differently than 20 years ago in the Yugoslavian case when we needed the United States, now without the United States.
We have come to expect, Markus, Kaim, haven't we, the United States to be involved in almost every single international conflict. In the Ukraine, as Alexander Rahr is saying, the US is mostly absent. The notion of the world's policeman, is that something that the United States, the concept that it's embracing or that it is reluctantly adopting?
I think I don't really like the term decline because it refers to the question of capability. Is somebody capable? And as Alexander has mentioned, there are still military capabilities of the U.S., economic capabilities. So it's way more precise, in my view, to phrase it as a question of will. The U.S. political class, as well as the citizens of the U.S. simply do not have an interest anymore in influencing the world, maybe even dominating the world. It's a question of nation building at home, as the U.S. president has mentioned a couple of years ago. And the priorities are pretty clear. And the Europeans are still, in my view, in the process in coping with this change. And I fully agree with you. A question affecting or taking place in the European periphery, be it Ukraine, be it North Africa, be it Caucasus, now are questions for the Europeans to cope with. And the European Union, as well as European capitals, are still looking for ways to cope with it.
And the military might, Smale, of the United States is still undisputed. Let's just look at this one number. The military budget of the United States is $700 billion strong, which accounts for 40% of the world's military spending. So right there, you know that the United States, at least militarily, is not in decline. But what about morally, as Alexander Rahr suggested?
Well, I think morals is always a very difficult thing to debate, particularly in international politics, where anybody who's ever played a game of Risk knows that it's a kind of a roll of the dice and the amount of diplomatic and military power you have at your disposal. I think that what we have to look at is what is also happening inside the United States. I mean, after World War II, there was a fairly clear sort of transatlantic elite, particularly between Germany and the United States, but in general between Europe and the United States. These were people who shared backgrounds and so on. The nature of the United States and the nature of European societies are changing. And in the United States, you see the rise of the Hispanic vote, for instance, as being very important. This makes even the language different. I'm not sure that we're sort of seeing an absolute retreat into isolationism. I think every time we talk about that in the United States, bingo, along comes a crisis whereby the United States feels obliged to act and proves once again that, you know, international affairs actually do affect America. So I'm not so sure talking about the absence of America. The difference is that now there's much less need for the United States to be involved in something like the Ukraine matter, which really puts the onus, I think, an interesting onus on Germany, because Germany is without question the largest economy in Europe. It has a historical interest in all of these areas that are now seen as Europe's periphery. I would perfectly just call them part of Europe, honestly. But Ukraine, I think, is going to be a very, very key test of where Europe goes in the future and what kind of obligation Europeans, who may not have thought much about Ukraine, God knows, in their lifetimes, how much responsibility they feel for the outcome. And what ability do we have to engage the Russians in a truly constructive way, which I think is definitely possible. But we have to sort of come at it from the point of view of the situation is a complicated one. We have to sit down and try and help untangle it. That would be my thoughts on that score.
While the U.S. is not involved, or at least not apparently involved in Ukrainian affairs, Alexandra Rahr, but one country that certainly is very deeply involved is Russia, of course.
And Germany.
And Germany, for that matter. Now, picking up on the thought of Alison Smale on German leadership when it comes to Ukraine, would you like the Germans to be more involved or less so?
I welcome the speech of Mrs. Merkel in the Parliament the other day, where she said that Germany has to take more responsibility, also militarily outside the world, and Mr. Steinmeier, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, said the same. So the new German government is preparing the German elites, the German society, that Germany will be more acting in the years to come. They are not talking about involvement into Africa, which of course is needed, also to fight international terrorism in Africa and poverty in these countries of Africa. But at the same time, of course, Ukraine, the Caucasus are hotspots where European diplomacy has to be in. And from my point of view, to answer your question directly, I think that the Germans are, because of the traditional ties with Russia, special ties or whatever you call them. It's maybe not the best word, but I don't know how to call it differently. Germans had always a kind of approach to Russia during this Ostpolitik. Germany is indeed needed for engagement with Russia. There is a lot of trust between the elites of Russia and Germany. Their channels will function very well. And I think that if Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Putin go along, then we could find a solution for such a problem as Ukraine.
And Ukraine, Markus, Kaim, is seen as a litmus test, not just for Germany, but Europe in general as well. How serious is Europe really about spreading its values, about standing up for its values? And in the Ukraine, the verdict is still out, isn't it?
I mean, that's not a new insight, but I mean, when we talk about certain dimensions or certain parts of the European foreign security policy, we're talking about foreign policies, meaning we have to differentiate between a German approach, a French approach, a Polish approach, a Baltic approach, and that's an old problem of the European Union. However, I think it's pretty important. In the last years, we had a mismatch between the expectations towards Germany to shape the international order, meaning coping with the Euro crisis, the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, the transformation process of the Arab world. And the Germans never accepted this higher expectations towards shaping, influencing the world. And the new Merkel government seems to have a different worldview, or has come to very different conclusions, which is illustrated by a different approach to the Ukraine crisis. It's illustrated by a different approach towards Africa. And we won't see an Africa corps of the German army marching into Africa. So it's a very careful approach, however, way more engaged and using, so to speak, the German-Franco relationship, unlike the government before, and using more the common and security and defense policy of the European Union, actually following the traditional German foreign policy, using the European framework for German policies.
Mm-hmm. And Alison Smale, German leadership, the notion in and of itself, as you know, in Germany at least, is somewhat controversial, somewhat debated. Many people shy away from taking on a more prominent role, certainly when it comes to military affairs. Germany has practiced checkbook diplomacy for a number of decades. For you, who's not German, who's covering Germany, though, is that strange for you? Is that
the idea of Germany showing more leadership?
Or perhaps not being reluctant, or perhaps not being more willing to take on the leadership
What I think
role
is interesting, and maybe we'll hear more also at the Security Conference, which for the first time is being opened by an address by a German president. Maybe we'll hear a little more about how President Gauck thinks of the expanded foreign policy role, which he already spoke about back in October, quite interestingly. And we have definitely heard tones from Mrs. Merkel, from the Foreign Minister Steinmeier, from the Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen, which indicate that they have sat down and discussed a concept of greater German activism on diplomatic, possibly military, and the traditional economic front. What I would think may be difficult is to sort of get a whole societal change in view, because for so many decades pacifism has definitely sort of set the tone here, and the debate, I think, was more with would Germany become sort of like, dare I say it, a giant Sweden, a kind of, very pacifist welfare state. But it can't really be just by its geographic position, by its economic might, by its traditional role, by the influence of its culture and its language. So now it could be that we're at the interesting stage of finally seeing the German government ease into a greater world role. And then the question is, how carefully is that tied to Europe, so that the European allies don't have the feeling that Germany is somehow sort of lifting off. And economically, Germany is so much better off than most large European countries that there already is a little bit of a sense of lifting off economically. So the trick will be not to make it seem as if this is happening diplomatically, strategically.
Actually, I think for us Germans, it's very unusual to use the word leadership. And I think if a German politician uses the word leadership, yes, the subtext is co-leadership in a European context. Right. Co-leadership together with others. And who is the other depends on the context. That might be in a certain case France, maybe. That might be in a different context Poland, in a different context Great Britain, or coalition of all of them. Yeah. But it's leadership for the German public as well as the political class always means co-leadership in the framework of the European Union.
No, it's always also, and when Germans, when they are actually leading, they say take responsibility, which is a completely different concept.
Well, Alexander Rahr, of course, while Germans are still controversially debating the notion of leadership, the one country that has no problems or no issues with exerting its influence and power is Russia, of course. And Francis Fukuyama, the renowned author and political scientist, immediately after the end of the Cold War, of course, declared famously the end of history. Russia these days, many people are saying, is making a comeback. The question is that term misleading? Is Russia really making a comeback, or did Russia never really go away?
We have a very important year, 2014 now. We have to celebrate and to think about a lot of jubileums, about very important dates. The beginning of the First World War and the Second World War. There are 70 years and 75 years and 100 years. Plus another, for me, even more important date, because I witnessed this, was the fall of the Berlin Wall 25 years ago. We'll celebrate this in November. Time is coming to rethink in which situation our world is. And I think that the West made a certain kind of mistake to think in the terms of Mr. Fukuyama, that the Cold War was won, and now the whole world has to become democratic and full with Western liberal values under America and European leadership. We lived in such a luxurious thinking for about 10, 15 years. Now we start to understand as Europeans that to think in this way is becoming too arrogant from our point of view. We have to understand that the world is strikingly becoming multipolar, not monopolar. And for example, the BRICS countries are indeed trying to form their own forum in order to confront the West on certain issues, on economic issues, not on political issues. We are facing the emergence of very important structures in Asia, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by Russia and China, by the way. The Russian-Chinese alliance on this question is interesting enough. And Russia, of course, will build up a kind of new integrational model in the post-Soviet space, simply because others are doing this in their part of the world, and also because the European Union is not in the position to invite Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova to join the European Union. So I think it's also historically normal that these post-Soviet countries are trying to find a kind of new model of integration. Of course, Russia is the strongest economy, like Germany, the European Union, and will have more to say than others. The question is now how rebuild Europe, remodel it in the way that we will remember the 25th anniversary of the Berlin Wall, which started to change Europe peacefully, and we have now to do more to promote this process.
And Russia, Markus, Kaim, of course, is making its mark not just in the Ukraine, but also in Syria, of course, where it has played a pivotal role, which even led Forbes magazine to declare Russian President Vladimir Putin the most powerful man on earth, ahead even of President Barack Obama. The other country that a lot of people are talking about, and rightly so, of course, is China. Everybody's talking about the rise of China. China is the new kid on the block, the one, if you will, petted to take over the helm of the United States. Is that too simple of a statement to say that that China is the one to look out for?
I mean, the question is, what are you really looking for? I mean, if you're looking for the economic numbers, it's pretty obvious. Are you looking for the current tensions in the South China Sea? You might come to the conclusion that we're facing a bipolar world to come, or the bipolar international system to come. My point would be to focus on a slightly different thing. For example, if you check who among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council is the one providing the biggest troop numbers to UN peacekeeping operations, surprise, surprise, it's China. So that illustrates, maybe from a different angle, that China is not offering a different world order, but is trying to occupy, so to speak, the existing world order. So it's not an alternative approach. I think that would be foolish to assume, but China is very carefully using the existing multilateral frameworks, and I would be surprised if we will see negotiations about EU-China free trade areas in the years to come. So I think one of the key members of the international community, maybe not setting the agenda, but at least being a spoiler in different environments, will be China.
And of course, China, aside from its economic success that it has displayed, is also facing demographic challenges as well as pollution, air pollution, that is hampering down on the quality of life. Ever since, it's been mentioned, 100 years since the beginning of World War I. And we have come to expect, that generation at least has to come to expect American leadership. This is almost called the American century, with dominance of Washington, all reaching out to all 5 continents. But is that still true for our time? Let's have a quick look.
Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has become a global power unmatched in history and has used its dominance to promote a version of global security in line with US goals. China, Russia and other nations are beginning to dispute that role, and the world's economic power centers have shifted. But the military might of the US is still undisputed. It has hundreds of bases in dozens of countries all over the world. And its powerful security agencies have also been active on the digital front lines. Leaks by Edward Snowden and others have revealed the extent to which the US spies on both its enemies and many of its friends. Is it time for the US to step back from its role as the world's policeman? And if it did, what would take its place?
Well, Alison Smale, the question is, who will take America's place? Assuming that America, of course, will wane, if you will, in dominance. Because we've seen in Syria, haven't we? We've seen the limits of US leadership. There was the famous red line that President Obama placed upon, which President Assad were not to cross. He did cross it, still no US involvement. Would the United States in the past have let this go by without retaliation?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very difficult question to answer because every decision is made in a concrete situation. And let's face it, what was unexpected in Syria was that David Cameron did not expect to lose the vote in the House of Commons that didn't give him backing to use force in Syria. France was left high and dry because then the doubts started to grow in the United States. Eventually, we had this interesting compromise that seems to have worked on the fairly focused and narrow but not unimportant question of chemical weapons being removed from Syria. But I think Syria shows the limits of anybody's power when you have a very, very powerful, to go back to your point about Sunni-Shia divisions, Islamic terrorism, you have all sorts of powerful forces converging, which are not forces that traditionally have had anything really to do with the West, which is where we're speaking from, or indeed China, if we're talking about the rising power. Yes, Russia is involved because of the traditional alliance with the Assads and with Damascus, but I think that so far what we can see is that that alliance has helped in one way, and we don't actually know what the sort of balance of forces is going to be. What I do think Europe needs to think about is there is a huge outflow of people. This is a humanitarian tragedy. The sort of paltry few thousands that European countries have agreed to take in terms of refugees seems awfully small compared to the scale of the tragedy. And it is destabilizing Lebanon, it is destabilizing the whole neighborhood, quite apart from any actual battles for political or military influence.
And more than 100,000 people killed and more than 2 million refugees, resulting indeed in the Syrian war. And the war in Syria has not only shown the limits of countries, as Alison Smale, but also of international institutions, hasn't it, Alexander Rahr? The UN Security Council is pretty much impotent in dealing with this issue, which begs the question: do we still need institutions like the United States, the United Nations, for instance?
Yeah, good question. But I would say that there is one side element of the peace solution in Syria, which you didn't mention, and this is Iran.
Yeah.
If we would have a war in Syria, I think the Iranian question would now be, to solve the Iranian question would be impossible. Now the Iranian leadership, because the diplomats and not weapons are speaking in Syria, are more inclined to give up their nuclear weapons, if they had any, talk to the West, and I think we have seen a revolutionary development there in terms of giving our blockade of Iran and Iranian cooperation with us. And this will help us in many ways also to secure the situation in Afghanistan after the removal of NATO forces from that country and from this region. It gives hope that we can work with other countries like Pakistan. Iran will not support terrorism in this region anymore if we continue this dialogue. So it's a good situation which we have now. It could be better, but I think it's better than we thought a year ago. And on the institutions, well, very, very influential, I would say, knowledgeable people, like, for example, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, but all the others, are comparing the present world with the world of 1913 and 1914. They are not saying that we are...
That's bad news.
No, yeah, no, it's good news, because they are not saying that we are starting a new third world war, but they are telling us that the world has become like it was then. We don't have one superpower which commands the world and can control the world and can stabilize the world. We need the cooperation of many, many other countries, and I think the world has learned from the situation 100 years ago, which led to a war. We learned that we have to cooperate, and I think in Ukraine we start now a cooperation. We start a cooperation with Iran. 100 years ago, that all would have ended in a war. Now we are more clever, more intelligent, and lead forward. The UN probably is not the Security Council. The UN is not the body which we still can call the world leadership, because I mean, you know, a lot of leading countries like India are not in. The G8, we need China as part of the G8 in order to name G8 the cult of world leader. I think the G20 may become one day a kind of forum where this kind of questions, global question, can be discussed. But of course, we still need to find an instrument how to cooperate together.
Cooperation is the key word here, of course, but how do you cooperate with non-governmental actors such as Al-Qaeda, for instance? International terrorism has already been mentioned. Al-Qaeda, of course, ever since 9/11 has been on the agenda of the international security agenda, and it's still, if you will, imposing its will and influencing events in Iraq, in Syria, certainly in Yemen. The international community certainly hasn't found a way to tackle and grapple with this issue, has it?
I'm afraid you cannot cooperate with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. You have to fight them. Very simple. But on the other hand, counterterrorism has fostered international cooperation over the last 10, 15 years. I mean, how many resolutions we have in the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly? How much did the other international fora like G8, G20 talked and implemented certain measures with regards to transnational international terrorism? But I think we do not have to overestimate the role of international terrorism. I think we have to live, at least with a certain degree, as we have lived with domestic terrorism in some certain Western European countries in the 1970s. It does not really threat the international order as we know it and our standard of living.
But you have identified international terrorism as perhaps the single most important issue, security issue of our time. So the answer then is to just accept it, just to live with it?
My concern is not so much a single attack, terrorist attack, maybe in Berlin or in London and Paris. My way more bigger concern is something like Mali, and Constellation, where we have a combination of state failure, weak statehood, transnational organized crime, transnational terrorism inspired by Islam, and this really is a big concern in terms not only of national stability but also in terms of regional stability.
And cyber war, you have mentioned the cyber issue as perhaps if not the most single important one, but certainly one of the most relevant one. And the NSA leaks, the WikiLeaks have shown, Edward Snowden's revelations have shown how prevalent this issue really is and how defenseless even countries like Germany are.
I think there are a number of issues involved. If, for instance, we go to Iran, the question is what role, in fact, did cyber attacks play in the equation in Iran that appears to have helped bring the Iranians to the negotiating table. And I would agree that we've talked about problems mostly, but the Iranian situation is one that offers hope and a new path forward, which is certainly lacking in many areas of the world. Then you have the NSA affair, and you have the debate about what is the appropriate degree of government activity in this sphere? Should we do everything we technically can do or not? Then you have personal relationship to the internet, which touches everybody's lives in all sorts of ways, and from consumerism up to how governance regulates all of this. So I just think that because the digital technology is marching so fast and is changing the way humans conduct their affairs, that's something that you have to look at across the board and kind of weigh in every situation.
Well, Alexander Rahr, I think just the potpourri of issues and topics that we have discussed in only this short time span shows the complexity of the world that we're living in these days, and certainly that no single country, the United States, China, or Russia, can deal with them on their own. Now, if we look ahead, if we look a bit to the future, for countries like the United States, for countries like Russia or China, what is a recipe here for cooperation? You said communication is key here, and the lack of communication, if you will, has led to the First World War. Do you really see increasing communication between these countries?
Yes, we have no other choice. And first of all, we Europeans have to do our homeworks. This year will put us in a very responsible situation. All Europeans would have to elect a new European Parliament, 28 countries. And we have to decide in this vote what kind of Europe we want, because it will be a politically more stronger Europe. The new parliament will have more powers, commissions will have more powers. We need a stronger European president to lead Europe in future. We have the understanding of the national states, which would give more sovereignty to Brussels. We are in the phase of a reform in Europe, and this is a test for Europe this year. It's a test which will not be decided above, but by the people themselves. If they vote for right-wing politicians for this parliament, we will have no big Europe and no strong Europe. But I think this is a challenge for Europe, and Europe have to learn to become an actor together with Russia, together with China and the United States, who can take responsibility for the world.
Is this would you subscribe to the notion that Europe has to rise up to the challenge here?
Absolutely, absolutely. That would be one of my answers to the whatever you want to call it, U.S. retrenchment, isolationism, or whatever. That the Europeans have to at least identify certain priorities. I think nobody expects the European Union to play a crucial role in South Asia, Southeast Asia. Maybe that would be way too far and over ambitious. However, I think it's it would be in Europe's own interest to identify certain priorities for the European periphery. And in my view, that would be Ukraine, that would be the relationship with Turkey. We didn't discuss so far. That would be to shape the transformational process of the Arab world. And then we have a huge agenda for the years to come.
Well, I think one thing we actually haven't mentioned really is the European-US trade talks that are going on right now, and their parallel one, the US-Pacific trade talks. And the interesting thing about both of those sets of negotiations is that they really don't include China. And in fact, one of the selling points of the proponents of the EU-US trade talks is this is our ability to pull together 800 million people in one trading bloc, to sort of get our standards of manufacturing and so on to become the global standards, rather than facing a threat that it'll be the Chinese standards as they become economically ever stronger. So I think we've definitely got to think about that aspect of European affairs. The other thing is, yes, let's see how the vote turns out, but let's first of all see how many people actually go to vote. I mean, I think it's not going to be very easy for the European elite to argue we have a mandate to do X and Y if the participation is pretty weak, because that shows that people haven't really subscribed to the vision of, you know, we move around in the European elite world, but lots of people don't. And I'm not sure that they've heard the arguments that we need to become a more pulled together continent, as it were, if we're going to have influence on the world stage.
And Europe is still in a deep crisis. I think that people will come because, especially in the south and in the central of Europe, people are understanding more and more that Europe matters. They feel for the first time the solidarity between states, Germany and Greece, for example. But talking about this big picture which you had, this trade zone between the United States and Europe, or United States with Asia, I think there is another missing element. We also need to find a common vivendi with Russia.
Sure.
And with the post-Soviet space. And it's good. I think that Putin in Brussels the other day and Merkel the day afterwards were saying that we have to start talks about a joint economic zone between Lisbon and Vladivostok. It's better to have this kind of discussion than what some US politicians suggest, to have a world order with a huge transatlantic economic zone between Los Angeles and Donetsk. That would be wrong.
Yeah.
And I think what European leaders have to learn is that given globalization and the complexity of the problems you've just mentioned, I think it would be futile to look for a way that you can cope with the Syrian crisis, that you can cope with the Ukraine crisis on a national level. Maybe Germany has to contribute something, maybe the UK can contribute something, but at the end of the day, you need the multilateral framework for the European Union. So what we all have to learn that either you work through the European Union in terms of common foreign and security policy, or you're simply not influencing the world order anymore. And this is, I think, the crucial lesson for the 21st century.
A difficult one if you are the United Kingdom, with still harbouring its memories, 100 years since World War I, the defence of Europe in World War II. It's definitely still up for a question there.
Well, many, many issues that we have touched upon today, showing the complexity of the world that we live in these days. And perhaps Markus Kaim summed it up best when he said no country, including the United States, can tackle and solve these problems on its own. I want to thank my guests for a very insightful talk. Certainly the participants at the Munich Security Conference have their work cut out for themselves, judging on the many issues we've discussed today. Thank you out there for watching. Looking forward to seeing you next week.